Good morning, everybody, and welcome to CEID and our audiology webinar. I would like to introduce you to our new audiologist, Cookie, and she will be presenting today on understanding hearing. First, a couple of things to get them out of the way. This particular webinar is being recorded today. It's part of our CEID Community Connect series. It is will be recorded. We're gonna take the recording and we're gonna post it later on with captioning. The captioning details for this particular webinar are not working for some reason, and so it will be a post-production captioning, okay? And because you are being recorded, even though we don't have anyone on the screen, if you don't want your information shared, make sure that you keep your screen closed and your name hidden. And all the non-participating people should have their cameras off, okay? During the webinar, we have set this up like a kind of like a hybrid fireside chat. Cookie's going to present a couple of slides here and there and summarize, and then we'll have some questions at the end of her certain segments. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. That will be monitored, and we'll go through them as we go through her slides. Today's topic, of course, is understanding hearing and hearing differences. So with that said, I would like to introduce you to Miss Cookie. And unmute yourself, Cookie.
Perfect, thank you. As Sean Renee mentioned, we will be using the word hearing differences instead of the word hearing loss. It is something that I am trying very hard to do and practicing to get better at. So if I make some mistakes here or there, please forgive me. Okay, can I share my screen now?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I'm going to hide my screen until, I'm going to remove myself until you are ready for the summary. Okay.
All right, sounds good. Thank you. All right, so before we get started, I would just like to express my gratitude to CEID for supporting me in being here, as well as to Sean Renee for inviting me to talk with you all today, as well as to Anna, our Director of Operations, who you'll see down below, for helping us to manage all of the IT bits of this presentation. I'm super excited and happy to be here to share with y'all some information about hearing, and some resources that you can take away with you and hopefully answer some questions at the end of this. So my name is Iulani Mokupaiva, but I go by the name Cookie, pronounced just like the food, chocolate chip cookie. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I believe that all communication is good communication, regardless of the method, whether it's auditory verbal or visual based sign language or anything in between. I believe that the best method is whatever works best for your individual family. As the audiologist at CEID, I perform clinical evaluations, fit and manage amplification devices, and support the teachers and families in our classrooms with children who have hearing differences. A little bit of background about me: before becoming an audiologist, I taught 4th grade general education and did my undergraduate study in early childhood education and special ed. My passion is supporting kids with hearing differences and their families, as well as the educators and specialists that support them. There are several different types of hearing differences, as well as different ways to manage them, different types of interventions. Understanding the type of hearing difference affecting your child will help you to understand how it may affect your child's life, what can be done to maximize their development, and help you to choose the communication method of your choice. Again, whether it's visual, verbal, or any combination of the two. The structure of today's webinar will be as follows. So we will start by taking a look at the auditory pathway, understanding the chain of anatomical parts that are involved in hearing and how they function. And then we'll look at the types of hearing differences, how they occur, are they permanent or temporary? We'll look at newborn hearing screening methods and procedures that are used, and then finish up by sharing some resources that may be helpful to y'all and give some time for questions at the end. I'll also, as Sean Renee said, check on the Q&A at the end of each of these sections and answer any questions at that point as well. All right. Oh, Sean Renee, did you want to give the poll?
Absolutely. Are we ready?
We are ready for the poll.
Okay, I'm going to launch this poll, and hopefully you all can answer these questions. I'll give you like maybe 2 minutes. There we go. And then there we go. We have about 50%, 62%, looking for 100. All right. And I think we're about done. So about 87% of us have participated and answered the question. I'm going to end the poll.
Okay, hold on just a second. I'm just going to write down these responses so that I can call back on them. Thank you. Almost done.
Okay.
It looks like it's about the same across. All right, go. You are good to end the poll. Thank you.
All right. And we're going to share those results. Can you see the results?
I can see, I think so, yeah. When I look at the poll, I can see the percentage for each of the different options.
Good. All right, and you've got all that. Here we go. All right, thank you everyone for taking the poll, and these results will pop up sometime in our little presentation here. Go ahead.
Yeah. Cookie. Thank you. So the part of the point of the poll is to give us a better understanding of where you all are at in terms of understanding these various objectives for today's presentation. But I think it can also be helpful for you guys to know that if you're a person who doesn't feel 100% confident in the mechanism of hearing or your child's hearing difference or understanding an audiogram, you are not alone there. The vast majority of people who answered the poll were either in category 1 or 2, not really sure or would like to know more. So hopefully we'll be able to do that today. All right. So first we're going to start off by understanding how typical hearing works, and then we'll move into hearing differences. So in order for us to be able to hear, we need to utilize the 3 parts of the ear: the outer ear, middle ear, and inner ear, in addition to the hearing nerve or auditory nerve, as well as the brain. I like to emphasize these 2 parts as essential for hearing because I think oftentimes when hearing is explained, the role of the brain and the auditory nerve are not emphasized enough, and they really are so critical in that entire process. So the 3 parts of the ear, the outer, middle, and inner ear, change sound from waves into vibrations and then electrical signals that are sent via the auditory nerve. Think of it as an interstate highway up to the brain. The brain's role is to assign meaning to the sound. For example, am I hearing speech, music, mom and dad's voice? So we'll start with the outer ear here. So the outer ear is the part of the ear that sticks out from the head. That protruding part is referred to as the pinna. And the outer ear also includes the ear canal here. The pinna acts as a funnel that collects sounds from the environment, funnels it down into the ear canal to the middle ear. Now, the middle ear consists of the eardrum, otherwise known as the tympanic membrane, as well as the 3 bones of hearing, the malleus, incus, and stapes. Fun fact, these are the smallest bones in the body for any crossword lovers out there. So the middle ear is an air-filled cavity. When it's healthy and functioning, typically it's filled with air and nothing else. Think of it like a cave. So sound waves vibrate the eardrum, which then vibrate the middle ear bones and amplify the sound a bit. And then the vibration is sent over here to the inner ear or the cochlea. So the cochlea is this spiral object here, and it's called a bony labyrinth. It's made up of tiny hair cells that are surrounded by fluid. So the vibrations from the middle ear vibrate the fluid and the hair cells in the inner ear here, which then transform the sound from a vibration to electrical signals. These electrical signals tell the brain what pitch the sound is, as well as how loud that sound is. This coded message is then sent via the auditory nerve up to the brain, where the brain makes sense of the sound and assigns meaning to it. Again, for example, what am I hearing? Is it music, speech, mom's voice? Is it a noise that I can ignore? All of that meaning making happens up here in the brain. Next, I'm going to show you a brief video of this process in action. So stand by.
Sound enters the ear and is directed through the ear canal, where it first reaches the eardrum. As the eardrum begins to vibrate, it sets the ossicular chain in motion. The ossicular chain consists of the hammer, anvil, and the stirrup. Sound vibrations move along the ossicular chain and into the inner ear. Within the inner ear, the cochlea plays a central role. It is here that the mechanical energy of sound is converted into complex electrical signals, which are then passed on to the brain. In simplified terms, the cochlea is a spiral-shaped tube filled with fluid. Sensory cells, also called hair cells, line the entire length of the cochlea. These hair cells have varying degrees of sensitivity for the detection of different tones or frequencies. This allows the ear to perceive the entire spectrum of sound. The change from mechanical vibration to electrical pulse is a complex process resulting from the movement of hair cells in the cochlea. Along the entire length of the cochlea, the hair cells are arranged like the keys of a piano. Hair cells located at the base or lower region of the cochlea are responsible for high frequency, while hair cells at the apex are responsible for the low frequencies. The auditory cortex of the brain interprets this information as sound, for example, as music or speech. The entire chain of events, including the various steps that convert sound waves from the environment into information that the brain can interpret, happens so fast that individuals can hear sound both continuously and instantaneously. Within this complex chain of events, there are a number of factors which can cause an individual to experience hearing loss. A loss of hearing can range from a mild to moderate hearing deficiency to a total hearing loss.
Right, and we're back. So in summary, the sound enters the outer ear, the eardrum vibrates the bones in the middle ear, which causes the fluid and hair cells in the inner ear to vibrate. These vibrations cause electrical signals. The signals travel through the auditory nerve up to the brain, and the brain makes meaning of the sound. In a nutshell, crystal clear. Sean, Renee, are there any questions in the chat or Q&A?
There are no questions in the chat or the Q&A, but I am wondering, does anyone have anything they want to type in really quick before we move on? Let's see. No, I think we're good. Go ahead.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, everyone. All right, moving on. So next we're gonna head to looking at hearing differences, what their causes are, and then talk a little bit about intervention. So again, when we asked at the beginning of this webinar, on a scale of 1 to 3, how confident were you in explaining the type of hearing differences your child has? About 60%, 60 to 70, or actually 80, up to 80% of you were either in the 1 or 2 category, not exactly sure what type of difference it is, or having some information, but wanting to know more about specifically about your child's hearing difference. So today we're going to discuss the 4 main types of hearing differences: conductive, sensorineural, mixed, and auditory neuropathy spectrum difference. We'll talk about the impact of the hearing difference, which is determined by the part of the system that is impacted, which anatomical features, where the difference is occurring, the outer, middle, inner ear, auditory nerve, or the brain. Some types of hearing differences are temporary and others are permanent. Right. So a conductive hearing difference is when the difference is occurring in your child's outer ear or their middle ear here. And the inner ear, auditory nerve, and brain are functioning typically. A conductive hearing difference can be temporary or permanent, depending on the cause of the difference. And with a conductive hearing difference, typically there is something that is blocking or impeding the path of sound from arriving at the inner ear. So this conductive loss can be due to blockage, such as earwax in the ear canal or fluid in the middle ear obstructing the path of sound. This can happen when a child has a buildup of wax, or if they have a middle ear infection, for example. If the doctor or ENT tells you they have some fluid in their ear, that's what they're referring to. The fluid is in the middle ear, surrounding these middle ear bones. So this space that is typically occupied by air is now occupied by thick fluid, which can honestly sometimes be as thick as rubber cement that needs to be sucked out with a suction device. So in terms of the impact on hearing, one way to think about it is the difference between hearing, say you're at a pool or at the ocean and you're trying to talk to somebody below the water. You can tell that they're talking, but the clarity of the speech signal itself will be significantly reduced compared to when you're talking to somebody above the water. It's much more clear when sound travels through air instead of water. A conductive difference, can also occur when there's a hole in the eardrum. Holes can happen due to spontaneous bursts, due to infection, impact, barrel trauma, when you're going maybe up and down in an airplane, change in pressure, or temporary ear tubes, excuse me, that are sometimes put in order to help drain that chronic middle ear fluid. So when the conductive hearing difference is due to something transient, such as the middle ear fluid or the wax or the hole in the eardrum, these types of differences are typically temporary. Once the blockage is removed, either on its own or through medical intervention, the hearing difference should resolve and hearing will be back at the typical level. But I do want to note that chronic ear infections can sometimes lead to permanent hearing differences of varying degrees, just depending on the severity of the ear infections and how chronic and often they were happening. Some examples of permanent conductive differences are differences in the outer ear or pinna, for example, in these images here. So these differences can range from what we call microtia, which is a small pinna, small outer ear with a very narrow ear canal, which gives a much smaller pathway for sound to travel down to the middle ear, or a complete absence of the outer ear altogether. These types of differences, as well as any differences with the bones in the middle ear, the bones being not completely formed or disarticulated, not completely connected together, can result in a permanent conductive difference that can sometimes be addressed with medical intervention or surgical methods. But if you don't take any surgical action on it, typically these conductive differences are permanent. The next type of difference we'll talk about is called a sensorineural hearing difference. And this occurs when the hair cells in the inner ear or cochlea either are not developed typically or are damaged. With a sensorineural difference, the outer ear and middle ear are functioning typically, but the site of difference is again in that inner ear or the nerve, or it can even be up to the brainstem or auditory cortex of the brain. Here, next I'll show you a quick video to illustrate the sensorineural difference.
Cookie, when you play the video, could you try to turn on the captioning from YouTube?
Oh yes, thank you for that reminder. Let's turn on the captioning. All right, thank you.
Another kind of hearing loss is called sensorineural hearing loss because it can include different types of hearing loss. Sensory, which happens when the cochlea doesn't work well or not at all. Neural, where the auditory nerve or other parts of the brain are affected, or even a combination of both. The cochlea plays an important role in hearing by amplifying soft sounds as well as separating all the different pitches or frequencies of sounds. It's like a piano, but with even more keys. The cochlea also sends messages about sounds to the brain by activating the auditory nerve.
All right. So a sensorineural hearing difference can have many different potential causes. Sometimes it can be due to genetic mutation, it can be passed down from parents, part of a syndrome. A viral infection can occur in utero or at birth, such as CMV, hyperbilirubinemia, or meningitis. And sometimes the reason for the hearing difference is completely unknown. So oftentimes, once hearing loss is diagnosed, genetic testing is often recommended to find out more about potential causes, indications as to whether this hearing difference might be progressive or not, and especially if parents are thinking of having more kids afterward. The management of a sensorineural hearing difference really depends on the degree of the difference. So is it a small difference or is it a very significant difference? If your family's goal is to develop spoken language, amplification devices like hearing aids or cochlear implants may be appropriate in order to provide your child's brain access to sounds so that they can learn to understand and produce those sounds. If sign language is the goal, or a type of visual language, then at that point, everyone in the child's immediate sphere is encouraged to begin to learn sign with the goal of eventually becoming fluent, ideally. You would start to want to connect with the deaf community, deaf peers, and role models to really help your child to become immersed and a part of the deaf community. And then if total communication is the goal, so a combination of visual language, signing, and auditory verbal, you would do a combination of both. The next type of difference we'll talk about is a mixed hearing difference, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a mix of both a permanent hearing difference and a conductive hearing difference. So when a person has a mixed difference, there is an anatomical difference both in the inner ear / auditory nerve / in the auditory cortex of the brain, as well as a difference in the middle ear or the outer ear. Mixed differences can be temporary. If there's a blockage due to wax, for example, or an ear infection in the middle ear causing fluid. And at that point, once the conductive component resolves, once the blockage is removed, your child's hearing difference will return back to the level of just sensorineural. An example of a permanent type of mixed difference would be if a child has an outer ear difference, like this kiddo here. He has a very small outer ear without an opening to the ear canal. So he has that blockage due to the difference in his outer ear, but then he may also have some difference in his inner ear, which is adding to the level of hearing difference. The last type of difference we'll talk about today is called auditory neuropathy spectrum difference, or if you were to look it up on Google, it might say auditory neuropathy spectrum disorder, ANSD. So ANSD is when there is dyssynchrony of the firing of the neurons at one or more anatomical locations, which could occur at any one of the spots between the inner ear and the nerve, in the nerve itself, or in the brain. So neurons are responsible for firing all at the same time to help us create this full visual picture of sound. Let's go to the next slide. And when that sound or when that picture doesn't all come through at the same time, what it can result in is just very unclear sound. So I like to use this image of President Obama to kind of represent the spectrum quality of ANSD. This picture here represents what typical hearing looks like. All of the neurons are firing together. The picture is very tight and clear, and it's very evident what we're looking at. But as the dyssynchrony of the neurons increases, so as they start to fire less and less together, the clarity of that speech signal is going to degrade and just be very unclear. Auditory neuropathy typically occurs in both ears in about 80 to 90% of people, but it can be unilateral. The degree of the hearing difference that it results in varies significantly depending on the level of asynchrony. And really the key feature of auditory neuropathy is that it manifests itself in poor speech understanding for that person's given hearing level. So typically when a person has a level of sensorineural hearing difference, we can predict with pretty good predictive value the percentage of speech that they should be able to understand with these hearing levels. However, with auditory neuropathy, the actual amount of speech that they're able to detect is is worse than we would expect, given the level of their difference because of this dyssynchrony between the neurons. So in summary, we talked about 4 different types of hearing differences. A conductive hearing difference, which is due to a difference in the outer ear or middle ear. A sensorineural difference, which occurs in the inner ear or up to the auditory nerve or the brain. A mixed hearing difference, which is a sensorineural hearing difference, and then on top of that, a blockage of some sort in the outer ear or middle ear. And lastly, we discussed auditory neuropathy, which occurs in the outer ear, nerve, or in the brain, and is due to a dyssynchrony of the neurons. I see some questions in the Q&A.
Cookie, can you see those, or would you like me to read them out for you?
I can read them, thank you. Okay, so the first question says, it sounds like learning sign language with sensory neural hearing difference with amplification isn't something that is 100% required. Can you speak more to the nuances around this? Even children without hearing differences are learning sign to help with communication. Thank you for asking that question. So it sounds like you're wanting to understand more about the relationship between the degree of the hearing difference and when sign language is appropriate or encouraged, or the word you used was required. So first I'll speak to the part at the end. So yes, even children without hearing differences are learning how to sign. And I believe that the reason for that is because it gives children an alternative way to sign and communicate with their caregivers, even before they're able to produce clear speech sounds that caregivers can easily understand. When it comes to using visual language, sign language, ASL or C-sign with a child with a hearing difference, typically when it would be strongly encouraged or required would be just based on your family's goals, really. So if your goal is, well, it's a combination of the two things, I should say. It's a combination of your family's goals as well as your child's degree of hearing difference. So if your child has a very significant degree of hearing difference to the point that their hearing difference isn't aidable, so auditory access by means of amplification, like a hearing aid, for example. Their hearing loss is so great that amplification is not going to help them. Then at that point, developing visual language would be highly recommended. In addition to thinking about what your family's goals are for your child. If they do have a significant level of hearing difference that is not aidable with hearing aids, another option could be a cochlear implant, depending on what your medical team decides. But if a cochlear implant is not something that you'd like to pursue as a family, then at that point I would highly encourage my families to look into developing sign language and using that method to communicate with them, because they just don't have enough usable hearing to be able to develop spoken language. When there are kids who have lesser degrees of hearing differences, ASL or C, different types of visual sign language, I would say is not necessarily required, but it's always a good idea, I think, to give your child other ways and methods to communicate, especially if they have any type of communication delay. Having multiple options besides just producing speech to communicate their needs would improve communication. Sean Renee, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think what you said in the beginning was that, communication is important, and that it should be done to maximize your child's potential to develop communication in the mode of your choice, whether that's signing verbal, or a combination. As the home visit instructor, when I have any student, it doesn't matter what degree of or level of impact their hearing difference is, I really do want those parents to have a tool that allows them to communicate, because that's the most important thing. And sign language is such a wonderful way to do that. And we see that again, even with children who don't have hearing differences, how those families are also trying to use sign as a communication device. So I really always say it's so important, regardless as to the level of impact their hearing difference makes.
Thank
That was
you.
it. And there
Thank
is
you.
one more question in there.
Okay. The second question says, is auditory neuropathy diagnosed the same way as the other hearing differences? So auditory neuropathy diagnosis so it depends on the age of your child. So in order to diagnose auditory neuropathy, we would want to have an ABR, otherwise known as auditory brainstem response. And that is when we put electrodes on your child's head and measure brain activity in response to auditory stimuli, either by putting headphones or insert earphones into their ear. So auditory neuropathy is looking at comparing the brain's response to sound compared to the response by the inner ear. So the dyssynchrony of the neurons that I explained is happening somewhere between the inner ear and the brain. So with auditory neuropathy, we might expect them to have typical functioning, again, of the outer ear, middle ear, and sometimes even the inner ear. But then once that dyssynchrony occurs along that pathway between the nerve and the brain, we will see a significantly reduced brain activity in response to that sound. So auditory neuropathy typically involves some type of ABR evaluation, especially in younger kids. In older kids, it can vary depending on what their symptoms are, how they present. Auditory neuropathy can also be measured, or I should say the impact of the auditory neuropathy can be measured inside of, in a testing booth when we present speech stimuli, either in the form of single words or sentences, and measure their ability to clearly understand what they're hearing, and comparing that ability, that speech understanding, to what we would expect them to be able to understand given their hearing differences. So there are a bunch of different measures that are used as cross checks to really confirm and build up support for a diagnosis of auditory neuropathy. In our next webinar, which is going to come, I think in April or May, we'll talk more about different intervention strategies, including intervention for auditory neuropathy. So thank you for asking that question. I'm going to close the chat now. Okay. All right, so we've talked about the anatomy and physiology of typical hearing and how it works. We've talked about the 4 main types of hearing differences, and now we're going to talk a little bit about newborn hearing screening. So all babies born in hospitals in the United States should receive a newborn hearing screening before they are discharged. Hearing difference is the most prevalent difference present at birth, occurring in about 30 of every 10,000 live births, which is a lot. So the goal of the newborn hearing screening is to identify with children with hearing loss as soon as possible in order to maximize their development, communication, education, and quality of life, not only of the child, but of their family and of their support network as well. Newborn hearing screening has significantly reduced the age at which hearing differences are being diagnosed, from about 3 years old in 1987 to 2 to 3 months old when newborn hearing screening began. There are 2 different measures that are used for newborn hearing screening. The first is called otoacoustic emissions, or OAE, or auditory brainstem response, ABR. Both of these methods are valid, and each hospital on its own decides which method they will use, and some hospitals choose to use both. So both measures work by putting sound into the baby's ears through a headphone here or an insert earbud, and then measuring how the baby responds to the sound. The difference is that the OAE, otoacoustic emission, measures the movement of the hair cells in the inner ear or cochlea, whereas the ABR measures brain activity in response to the sound. Both methods perform equally well in identifying hearing differences. And the sensitivity is about 90 to 100%. So meaning newborn hearing screenings are able to correctly identify a child with a hearing difference 90 to 100% of the time. And the specificity is 94%. So 94% of the time, kids that have typical hearing pass the newborn hearing screening. When a child passes a newborn hearing screening, it means that they have typical hearing or at most a mild hearing difference. When a baby does not pass a newborn hearing screening the first time, they will be rescreened a second time in both ears, either before discharge or in an outpatient setting. If the child does not pass the rescreen, they are referred for a comprehensive diagnostic evaluation. The outcome of the newborn hearing screening, whether it's a pass or a refer, is reported to the Department of Health and the Early Hearing Detection and Intervention Center, otherwise known as EDI, so that they can follow up with families that were referred to ensure that the baby does go forward to receive a diagnostic evaluation and intervention in a timely manner. The benchmark gold standard of care, as defined by EDI, is what we call 136. So ideally, by 1 month of age, a newborn has had their newborn hearing screening. If they refer, they should have their comprehensive diagnostic evaluation by 3 months of age. And then by 6 months of age, ideally sooner, they would begin to receive intervention support services in the form of early intervention, home visits, amplification, if that is the route that family chose, and help learning to sign, if that is the route that they chose to go instead.
Uh-oh, Cookie, you went to mute.
Unmute. All right, am I back?
Yes, you are.
Hello. Okay, great. That was weird. Okay, so next I will check the Q&A, see if there's any more questions. No questions at this point, but feel free to continue to pop questions into there as they come into your head. I'm just going to go on to the next section and share some resources. So I'm going to share, put these slides into the chat before we end today. But in the next couple of pages in these slides, I've listed some resources that will maybe be of help to y'all as you continue on whatever journey that you're on at whatever place you are in your journey. California Hands and Voices is an amazing, amazing resource that provides family-to-family support with advocacy, IFSPs, IEPs. They have a yearly family camp for families, as the entire family, as well as for your children with hearing differences, to connect with other kids. And if you just so happen to not be in California, Hands and Voices is present all over the country, and they're really, their goal is to provide unbiased support and information about different types of communication methods, whether it's using your voices or your hands. So highly recommend Hands and Voices. There's also some other resources here that have some really nice printables that you can take with you, including a checklist of questions to ask your audiologist at your next visit. questions to ask your healthcare provider or ENT about your child's hearing difference to help really get you some clear information and to help you to really understand the impact of your child's hearing difference. I know for me personally, when I am in a doctor's appointment, sometimes I can feel a little bit intimidated to ask my doctor to clarify what they're saying if I'm not sure, or I can't really think of the right questions in the moment and I'm just kind of taking it all in. So I find that having this list of prepared questions can be really nice to kind of take the pressure off of you in the moment, and to just have it ready when you're there. There's also some other additional information resources. There's a really nice diagram of the ear if you're interested in having it maybe to show to explain to family members or any caregivers about your child's hearing difference, as well as some an audiogram and some tips for managing hearing aids and cochlear implants if that's the journey that your family is on. There are links to the 2 videos that I shared as well. And that's all that I have for you all today. We're going to have the second part of this webinar, like I said earlier, either in April or May, and focus more on understanding the audiogram, really making sense of those symbols and acronyms and all the words on there so that you feel empowered to ask for what you need from your providers, from your child's educators, and really get into the more depth with amplification options if that's something that your family is doing right now. Okay, I see a question. Laura asks, the biggest issue for our kids is access to language and language development. Is there an easy way to see from a child's audiogram the impact on language development? Great question, Laura.
Awesome question. And that question is going to lead into our next webinar.
Exactly.
Do you want to touch on it a little bit?
Yeah, so I'm going to read this again and think about it for a minute, the best way to address it. So I think I feel like you're looking for a way, whether it's the audiogram or maybe another indication, to figure out how is this hearing difference going to impact my child's language development. And if you're in the stage where your child has just been diagnosed with a hearing difference, they're a baby, yes, the audiogram can give you an idea about kind of what type of intervention might be needed in order to develop language. So for example, if they have a minimal hearing difference, I'm going to put this caveat in there, is not nothing. A minimal hearing difference is still worth pursuing, following up with intervention and therapy. But the impact of a minimal hearing difference on your child's language development requires different intervention than a significant hearing difference. So if your child has a mild or a moderate severe hearing difference, the development of their language will be determined by your intervention choice. So if your goal is to have your child to be speaking and verbal and listening, then in order for them to develop language, you'll need to get amplification, get devices on them in order for them to hear those sounds that we're wanting to produce. On the other hand, if your child has a hearing difference that is significant and you're thinking, I don't want to go the amplification route, then at that point you're going to pursue sign language. And the impact on their language development is really at that point dependent on the intervention services that they get and a full commitment to pursuing those services and immersing your child in language, regardless of whether it's sign or spoken. So overall, I think my answer to your question is that the greatest impact on your child's language development is not going to be determined by the audiogram. It's going to be determined by the intervention that they receive, the commitment by the family to really immersing the child in language, whatever form, visual, or I'm sorry, auditory or sign. And if sign is the option that works best for your family, then commitment to that will look like learning to sign, becoming fluent in sign, connecting with the deaf community, and really getting your child in a space where they are surrounded by fluent signers that they can learn from and observe and emulate, much in the way that children who are hearing, who have typical hearing or use auditory verbal, the way that they're immersed in and around speaking and listening environments.
Cookie, I absolutely love that answer. It is really about what we're putting in, and that's a really good way to look at it. We are at the end of our time for this webinar. If there are any questions out there, please make sure that you get them into the Q&A box, and we will get to them. In the meantime, I would like to thank Cookie for coming in. She's one of our newest staff members, and when I asked her about this webinar, she jumped right in, all 2 feet, and said, absolutely, I'm ready to do that. So I'm really, really happy with our presentation, and I want to thank you so much, for coming in. I also want to share that at the end of this webinar, you will all receive a survey, and we'd really like for you to fill those surveys out because they give us information about what we're going to do for our next presentations. We're interested in what you've learned in this presentation. We want to find out, does it need to be better? How can we better serve our families? So I want to make sure that we get those surveys back. If you can also, I think what we're going to do is add the PDF to the chat. Mm-hmm. So I think we're adding that in there. If not, that once this is post-production and it's all captioned, we're going to make sure that everybody gets a copy of the handout that Cookie used. So you can take your own notes and add them to those. Okay. Is there any other question out there that anyone wants to ask before we leave? Or do you have anything else to add, Cookie?
Just that my contact information is below. Feel free to email me with any questions and I'll do my best to help. Thank you, Sean Renee, for putting this together and again, inviting me. And Anna, thank you for being so on it with all of our IT needs. I'm gonna drop the slides in the chat.
All right.
Right now. Before I forget.
All right. And I just want to also let you know, so our next webinar, we don't have a date for audiology. However, we are going to be talking about the audiogram, how to read it, and about devices. So please be sure to look out for that information once it hits the internets. And I want to thank you all for coming and participating. Your time and effort to come is really appreciated. And she just dropped it into the chat. So if you all want to take a couple of minutes and pull those down, you'll also get them in an email and a note telling you when the webinar has been posted. So I'd like to thank you all for attending. I appreciate you and have a good day.
Yeah, everyone, I'm sorry. I'm going to send it again because I only sent it to the panelists. Let me try that again.
Okay. One more time.
Thanks, Anna. Participant slides. Here we go. All right.
There we go. Okay. And everyone, y'all got that?
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. I really want to express gratitude to y'all for being here today, too, for putting in the work, for learning, for asking questions, for being present, for caring. I know that you guys are already doing so much already in your lives to help support the language development of your kids, whether it be at home, in the playground, in the car, in the grocery store. You guys are already doing a great job. So I just want to give you all kudos for that. Remember to be compassionate with yourself. Times get hard, and just know that there's always tomorrow.
All right. Thank you, everyone.